Welcome to the Woman's Connection. I'm Barrie-Louise Switzen, your moderator. The Woman's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
Welcome. It gives me great pleasure to have our guest here tonight. She has written a book on a biography of an 18th century woman, but what is more interesting is she's woven her life into this biography. And I'm not going to tell you anything more about this 18th century woman, so let's go to the 21st century and welcome Molly Peacock. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
My pleasure. Now, you wrote a book, The Paper Garden. Mm-hmm. Artist begins her life work at 72. I had to admit that when I was reading this book, it was like I'd read about the 18th century, and then all of a sudden I'm in the 21st century, yes. And I was going back and forth, and it was like, wait a minute.
What's happening here?
Exactly.
Well, the thing is, I didn't want to write one of those boring 900-page biographies of an 18th century woman nobody ever heard of. I wanted to bring Mary Delaney alive. Here she was at 72, inventing a brand new art form. We think Picasso invented collage in the 20th century, but in fact, Mary Delaney was cutting out hundreds and hundreds of brightly colored pieces of paper and composing them into botanically accurate portraits of flowers, inventing a precursor of collage in 1772.
That's terrific. I mean, how did she start doing this?
It's amazing. So she's 72 years old. This is what happened. She was in a period of mourning in her life. And her friend, she was living with a friend who happened to have been, I have to admit, the richest woman in England at the time. Now, Mary Delaney was born a minor aristocrat, but she had no fortune. And she had an early marriage and then a marvelous second marriage, just a wonderful second marriage. And after this husband died, she went into this period of grief for about 4 years. And the friend didn't quite know what to do with her. And she said, well, I'll take you to this garden. So she takes her to this garden where she gets stung on the foot by what she calls a gnat. And her foot blows up to twice its size. And they get her back home and they say, okay, you've got to stay still with your foot up. And they set her up at a table with all of the things that she'd done to entertain herself throughout her life. So she was a wonderful embroiderer. They had all of her embroidery tools and her thread and cloth. She was a watercolorist, so they had her watercolors there. She was a silhouette cutter-outer. And they had her silhouette papers there. And her friend, who was a duchess, was also a plant collector. And so she put a geranium right next to her. A common geranium, the kind that you or I would grow in a pot, but it was exotic then. And so she's very still. And she looks at this geranium, and she watches a petal. This is a rose, but you could pretend it's a geranium. She watches a petal from the geranium slowly drift onto a piece of black paper. And she notices there's a piece of red paper close by that's a similar color. And she's mesmerized. She's been a noticer her whole life. It's the kind of thing, if she were talking to you right now, she would count the number of buttons on your jacket. She's that kind of noticer. And so she picked up her scissors and began cutting out the petal shape from the red paper to match the geranium. And just because she had to stay still, she was a busy person, but because she was required to be still, and she was in this period of grief, of doing what we all do when we grieve. She's reviewing her life. She's reviewing her life with her husband. Her sister also died, whom she adored. She's going back over her life in that state that we get into of remembering and sadness, and she's occupying herself with her hands in the still moment. And that's the moment of invention.
Now, she did almost 1,000 by the time she died.
She did 985.
Okay, and she died in when she was 82?
She did them for 10 years, from 72 to 82. She died when she was 88 because, and she stopped, though, at 82 because she was losing her eyesight. Mm. Now, this isn't a terrible, sad ending where she goes blind and the worst happens. She gradually loses her eyesight, but by that time, she had become so well known for this that she was invited to live at the castle with King George III and Queen Charlotte. So she actually spent the last 6 years of her life with the King and Queen.
That's incredible.
It is. It's an amazing, amazing story.
It's like she would strive for this all her life,
yes,
and she finally achieved it.
Yeah.
Basically on her deathbed, you can almost say.
Well, I mean, in a way, I mean, she was a person who retained her flexibility all of her life. I mean, there were obstacle after obstacle was thrown in her path. And she was constantly rebalancing. And her whole life is a lesson to us in how we have to rebalance all the time. It's not like you attain some sort of centering. It's that you're always moving back and forth, rebalancing. And that's what she was doing.
She's very resilient.
Extremely, extremely, since she was a child.
Now, what challenges did you have doing research on her?
I have to tell you, I mean, I'm a poet. I think of myself as a searcher, not a researcher. And I first saw Mrs. Delaney's work at the Morgan Library in 1986, so that's a long time ago. And I was riveted by it. And I thought, oh no, you're supposed to be up at the Museum of Modern Art looking at abstract painting, but here you are looking at the work of this 18th century woman. It was unforgettable, but of course I saw it and I just sort of went off into my regular life, into the storm of my life, like everybody else's storms of their lives. And it wasn't until 2003, in the midst of my happy second marriage, when I was in England at the British Museum, and my husband was making a phone call, and this is just before international cell phone, so he was in the phone booth, and I was bored, so I went into the gift shop, and he was on the phone for a really long time, so I went through every table in the gift shop, and on the last table was the book about Mrs. Delaney that I had passed up because I was a 7th grade teacher at a Quaker school when I first saw them, and so I passed up the great big hardcover catalog thinking, oh, well, you can't afford that. But there it was. So I bought the book, and on the plane home started reading it and thought, whoa, Mrs. Delaney had this remarkable midlife flowering with her second husband, because the first marriage was a horror. And I have this kind of marriage. That was the first connection. The second connection was she started this life's work at 72, 73, and my mother died at that age. And it just pierced me. I thought, here's this woman inventing an art form at the time when my own mother died. And there's something in me that always looks for role models. My whole life I have, and my mother was a wonderful role model to me, but I wanted a role model for the stage beyond which she could show me. And there was Mrs. Delaney.
It sounds like she's a role model for a lot of people. Yeah. When you think about it, 72, creating something
incredible,
so beautiful with all her flowers. in being able to do the minute.
She did, and it was spectacular, she designed her court dresses, and these court dresses at the time had side hoops, and they went out like this, and the fabric stretched across. So it was it was almost like fabric that came right off the bolt. Do you know what I mean? Like almost like a curtain. You could see the whole sweep of the fabric. And she designed a botanically accurate flowers to be embroidered in silk, in brightly colored silk on a black background. And then she would go into the court, and you have to imagine the court. It's lit by candlelight.
Whoa.
So there would be this woman's face, and the black dress would recede into the background, and the flowers would be prominent and shining. So she would be like a moving garden going into the court. Very dramatic.
I was going to say, she knew how to play it then.
She did.
There are other books on Mary Delaney.
Yes.
What makes yours so different than all the other books?
The other books are more art books, museum books. This book is a reading book with fabulous color illustrations in it, so that there are, if you want to see, each chapter, begins with a flower, and the flower is a threshold into a chapter of her life. I didn't put every single detail about her life in the book. My question was, could I find out what it was in her life that allowed her this to become like the definition of the late bloomer? And so I went back through her letters to try to trace every instance of her creativity that I could find, starting at the age of 6. When she cut out silhouettes, these remarkable silhouettes. And because she left all these letters, she was a great letter writer. She was chatty, she was witty, she was gossipy, really fun, the letters are. And I began to find all these places where it turns out she was a wonderful spinet player, a piano player, that she knew Handel, went to his dress rehearsals, that she met Hogarth and got painting tips from him, that all along she was living an artistic life, doing a lot of crafts like embroidery and clothes designing, and then copying paintings, but not doing her own oil paintings. And it took a long time. All these things were contributing to this moment in her life when, struck with grief, she noticed that petal drop to the table.
Well, one of the things that I noticed about the book was that her resilience to all the things that were thrown at her, because she had a brother.
Yeah.
And she had, let's see, was it her brother? Her parents sent her to an aunt so that she could get schooling, not schooling, but in the sense of schooling that we know, but training, so she could be married, and she got married off at a very young age to a drunkard. Yes. And then the saddest thing is he wanted to change his will, and she didn't get the papers for him to sign, because and so therefore she was left basically almost penniless at that point. But what was interesting is that a lot of the things that happened in her day about a will and about owning property or anything, you fast forward, and it's just recently that women can have property, have voting rights. So there's a lot of, like there might be a span in years of a couple hundred years, but we still have the same issues.
That's what amazed me. It's suddenly 300 years just collapsed like that. And I was inside the life of this woman whom you would think, well, what's an 18th century woman's life compared to a 21st century woman's life? But all the emotional issues were the same. And when she's 17, her evil uncle marries her off to this gouty, snuff-taking, fat old squire. And imagine, the worst part of her life comes between 17 and 25. When there's not very much evidence of her creativity at all. And she says, he was my jailer. I mean, she actually calls him her jailer. Now that is unlikely to happen to a 21st century woman. But after that, she lived on her own with very little money. And many of us can identify with that. But with very well-to-do friends. So she was always having to negotiate that. And she was the sort of person who, she was very lively, but she also understood all of the social constraints around her. I mean, she wasn't a socially daring person. She knew that she had to behave in certain ways in order to be socially acceptable. But at the same time, she knew that she wanted to preserve her liveliness. And think of yourself, how many social constrictions you operate under and have throughout your life. Women are always treading these lines. We have these roles, we have our obligations, things that are demanded of us. We all respond in this way. And it's always our challenge to keep our liveliness, to keep our brightness and our imagination and who we are going within our responsibilities and our obligations, as Mary Delaney did.
And the other thing that was so fascinating about her was that they wanted to marry her off, and she spurned this lord.
She did.
Because she didn't want to marry him.
Oh, she was something.
She said he wasn't, what was it, exciting or interesting?
Yes, he wasn't, he wasn't well read enough. She felt that she had done her duty to marriage with her first marriage. I mean, when she got out of that, she's a young widow, which put her in some ways in British society in an ideal position because she could make some decisions for herself. And she did have a little bit of income. She had a widow's pension. So, I mean, she wasn't starving or anything. She had a little bit of a nest egg. So she's there, and she's making some determinations for herself, and she says, I am not going to get married again. I'm not going to marry this Lord Baltimore. I'm not going to marry these other people my family want me to marry. I'm out of here. I'm out of marriage. And she says that marriage is just problems with your mother-in-law and a pack of squalling brats.
Flowers are preserved at the British Museum.
They are.
As well as her letters.
Her letters were published by her great niece in 1861 and 1862. So we have her letter. Her letters are actually in book form. And this same niece gave all of her beautiful flower collages to the British Museum. And usually one or two are on display on the ground floor of the British Museum, but if you would like, you can go up to the print room on the 4th floor and ring the bell, and someone will peer around and ask you what you want, and you can say, I'd like to look at the Mrs. Delaney flowers, and they will invite you in, and if you put your bag in a locker and only agree to go in with the curatorial gloves on, they will put some in front of you and you can see them for yourself.
That sounds so exciting that they're still around after all these years.
Still around, and some of them have botanical material in them, where there are actual leaves or portions of the plant material pasted in them that have lasted for centuries, just with flour and water. Pasting them on.
Now, going forward, what is your next project?
Well, because I'm a poet, I'm finishing another book of poems, which is called Alphabetique, The Lives of the Letters as Written by T. And T becomes the biographer of the alphabet, because I got really interested in biography, tracking down the life of Mary Delaney and following in her footsteps. And I should say that my husband is a scholar, and I've watched him at his research for years. And when I tentatively started doing this, he was incredibly helpful to me. And I would say, oh no, I knew I had this note somewhere. Where did I put it? What have I done? I'm such a disorganized person. I'm just a poet. I was never meant to be a scholar or a researcher. And he would say, oh, Molly, all scholars are like that. They always lose everything all the time. You're no different. Just go ahead and keep plunging on. So I want to do another researched book. This time I think it's going to take place in the next century, the 19th century. And it's about all of the amazing garden and botanical information that was passed from woman's secret botanist to woman's secret botanist, because the women kind of weren't allowed to be major players with the male botanists of their time. And they wrote books that would be designed for other ladies and for children. And it was a whole like parallel track of women educating other women about flowers and about science. And so it's a very unformed idea because I'm just getting into it, but that's where I'm going. That's my path.
That sounds exciting. So what kind of poems do you specialize in?
I write I write very conversational poems. I could write a poem about the two of us here just talking.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, not right this minute, but I could use it as a subject. But it's also quite formal. I've written a lot of sonnets, villanelles, formal poetry, but very conversationally, so that you wouldn't recognize that it's a sonnet, because the rhymes are so kind of hidden. I didn't want to, in the same way that I went back a couple of centuries to resuscitate this amazing woman, Mrs. Delaney, I also am interested in resuscitating old forms of poetry, but in very 21st century ways. So that's what my poems are like. My latest book is called The Second Blush. It's a collection of midlife married love poems.
Wow.
And it's published by W.W. Norton.
Can you recite one of your poems?
Oh, my goodness. The best thing about a handmade pattern is the flaw. Sooner or later, in a handmade rug, among the squares and flattened triangles, a little red nub appears, and it makes a red bird fly, turning the rug into sky. It's almost as if a hand came through the weave, saying, "I'm alive, discovered by your eye."
Wow.
So that's a little poem called The Flaw. Because we all have to have a flaw, right?
How long does it take you? See, I don't know anything about poems, so I mean the rhythms,
my gosh.
I know we studied this in school,
Sure.
but it's like forever.
It takes me a very short time to write a lyric poem down, a small poem like that. Less than an hour. Okay, I'm just writing. I'm just, all of that's just coming out of me. And it's, what it's like? It's like doing an ice skating routine where you just have to hit the ice and do your routine. You can't stop, you're just doing it. And I feel like I can't stop when I'm writing the poem. But then afterwards, I'm looking at it. I'm tweaking it. I'm deciding that's not right. I've got to move this over here. There's a lot of revising that goes on, so that a poem that's born in 40 minutes can take, I mean, quite some time. It could take a couple of years to get finished, because I kind of go back to it. Some things get finished right away. I'm happy, and I send them out. Other things I go, there's just something wrong with this line. I have to wait until I'm in a space in my head where I can see it clearly and do that again. And the space in your head means you've got to recollect where you were when you wrote the poem. And that's the trick, matching your current emotion
with the past emotion.
Yes. How
old were you when you wrote your first poem?
10.
Okay.
I was 10. I didn't take it seriously, though, until I was in college. I was 19, and I had a poetry teacher, and he demanded that I start writing poetry. So I began to write.
He knew a gift.
I guess he did. Well, I'm really very grateful to many of my teachers who saw something in me. And I have to say, Mrs. Delaney had a teacher when she was 6, 7, and 8 years old who taught her how to cut these silhouettes, who must have seen something in her. And she remembers this teacher very fondly. And when I was 10, I wrote that poem. But then when I was 12, my 7th grade English teacher, whose name is Bernice Baumler, and we still have tea. She's very much alive, and we have lunch together, and I'm so grateful to her for encouraging my poetry. I thought I would just say that. We've all got people like that in our lives.
People who make an impression on us and help us to the next step in our life.
You don't even know it. You don't even know it at the time, but something in you is flowering because another person is watering the seed.
What would you like to leave the audience with?
I'd like to leave the audience with the sense that some things take living long enough to do. That Mrs. Delaney could not have had this flowering earlier in her life. She went through stages in preparing for it. That all life requires invention. We need our creativity till the day we die, and we all have to foster it, and she did.
That's great. Well, Molly, thank you so much for being a part of my show.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be here and to have this conversation.
It's been wonderful. And thank you for joining us. Are you starting on a new career? I know you're not 72, but are you starting on a new career? Love to hear from you. Please write us here at The Women's Connection. Bye now.